All right, so my name is Melissa Zablonski. I'm a social studies teacher at Putnam High School in Northeast Connecticut. And one of the main courses that I teach is US history. So tonight we're really going to take a look at the first unit that we get into, which is Western expansion. And looking at it just from a different lens, which is more of the indigenous lens and through the perspective of settler colonialism and this different narrative that we might not always teach our students. Oops. Okay. So hopefully everyone can see my screen. But we're taking a look here with Western expansion, manifest destiny, and settler colonialism, and looking at Western expansion more from a social justice lens as opposed to the typical, pioneers, Wild West, Oregon Trail type of instruction. So what I kind of wanted to just ask, and if you want to answer, go for it. If not, just think about it. But when you teach Western expansion, what are the essential questions and objectives that you use? What content do you cover when you teach this unit? And when you tell students that they'll be learning about Western expansion, what do you think they expect to learn? So I know, Amy, you're the only one here. If you want to answer that, you can. If you just want to think about it, that's fine. Um,
Yeah, we talk about, we use that. I know that, you know, the term manifest destiny is not what we should be really using if you're especially from taking more of a social justice lens, but saying, was it destiny to move west? That's kind of I teach eighth grade, so I don't know, it might be a little bit different than high school. Um, and then I think they do expect to see they just want to talk about the gold rush, like exciting, those kinds of things. The Oregon Trail, because it's a game, so
Mhm.
things like that. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. Kind of that, stereotypical Hollywood view of Western expansion. And my students still too, even at the high school level, they bring up Oregon Trail because they want to, play a game. But as we know, that kind of idea of manifest destiny, like you were saying, Amy, is definitely being challenged today. And so shifting the Western expansion unit to be looked at as settler colonialism, while still acknowledging the manifest destiny perspective, has been what I've been working on in my class to shift. And even though I'm high school, I think this could all definitely work at, the eighth grade level or the middle school level as well. So one of the things that I read last year when I was really looking at revamping my Western expansion unit was this article, and it's linked here. And I'll send this PowerPoint to Jenny so that if anyone wants to look at the links in the PowerPoint, you'll be able to access that. But it was this whole idea of unsettling social studies education. And the author said, unsettling social studies education is important for all teachers and students since all schools in the US operate on Indigenous lands. So it's our responsibility to learn and teach about the histories and continued connections Indigenous peoples have to the physical, social, economic, and cultural spaces that were forcibly taken by settlers. And so this is what really got me thinking about shifting my unit to focus more on the Indigenous perspective and not just about the atrocities that were committed against Indigenous peoples, but also learning about their cultures and celebrating those cultures as well. So my essential questions um, shifted instead of using manifest destiny to more shifting towards settler colonialism, and they're based off of the essential questions or the themes that were in the social studies framework for Connecticut. So really looking at how did the landscape, peoples, and cultures of the US shift as a result of settler colonialism during that historical period that we're studying. But also one of the things that I really try to do in all of my units, and I'm doing another session on this next week, is connected to the present day. So one of the other essential questions that we take a look at is how does settler colonialism continue to impact the landscape, peoples, and cultures of the US today? So acknowledging that it's not just something that's in the past, but it's something that's happening even today. And the objective is for really students to be able to evaluate the impact of westward expansion using the perspectives of manifest destiny, because a lot of them come from 8th grade learning that idea of manifest destiny, but then kind of shifting and using that perspective of settler colonialism. So we cover those two topics. And then the three other big topics that we cover during this unit, we look at some conflicts that settlers and the government had with Native tribes. We take a look at Indian boarding schools, and then we also look at specific Indigenous cultures. And so we really try to take a more deeper dive into these big areas as opposed to trying to cover everything. I used to look at pioneers, look at the Wild West and that kind of stuff. But now we really narrowed the focus, especially with COVID and, students are behind, just prioritizing the topics that we're covering. And these topics really help with the idea of settler colonialism. So the whole point is to really reframe that popular narrative of manifest destiny. So we start with what they know. And a lot of my students, like I said, learned about manifest destiny in 8th grade. And so I show them this picture and we work together to kind of write a definition and explanation of manifest destiny. And usually we come up with that definition that, God made it Americans' destiny to expand from coast to coast. And when we look at this painting, American Progress, we take a look at what were the forces behind manifest destiny and the impact of it. And obviously the perspective of this painting, students come to, realize through discussion, is it's a very positive perspective of manifest destiny. We're bringing light and technology and advancement to this otherwise dark and uncivilized land. And so that's this perspective that is associated with manifest destiny. But I tell them that we're going to be looking at it from a different perspective. And so we then take a look at this painting to introduce a new perspective. And I don't know if you've seen this painting before. It was something that I came across last summer as I was kind of revamping this unit. But it's by Charles Hilliard and it's called Reversing Manifest Destiny. And so it is very parallel to that American Progress painting, but we have an Indigenous woman in the center of it, reversing those effects. So taking back that telegraph line, and in this case, bringing light from their culture and from their society in the West to what looks like the very uncivilized and polluted East. And so we discuss the similarities and differences of the two paintings and their perspectives on westward expansion. And that's how we really get into the whole idea of manifest destiny is just one narrative, but it's not necessarily the one and only narrative. It's not necessarily the correct narrative. And we need to think about the millions of others that were impacted by this movement. And so students really enjoy looking at these two pictures side by side. Once we do that, this is a slide that I got from Amanda Sandoval and Dr. Danny Diaz. They did a presentation. I was like, again, when I was searching for different materials for settler colonialism last year, I stumbled upon a tweet that someone had with this picture on it, and I traced it back to the original PowerPoint. But it defines a narrative, and that's what we start talking about with students. So the idea that a narrative is something that's really just accepted in society and really reinforces the norms in society, and that these narratives can be created or passed along by your friends, your family, the media, education, the government, and that oftentimes these narratives really keep the status quo and don't necessarily challenge any kind of oppressive system that might be in place. So in the terms of westward expansion, we explain that, all right, the dominant narrative has been manifest destiny, and the non-dominant narrative has been settler colonialism. And this is where it comes, where it's important to connect back to the present day, because that dominant narrative of manifest destiny is still allowing oppressive systems against Indigenous peoples to stay in place today. Because again, it's this idea that it's our destiny. We were meant to do this. We were supposed to go west. There's nothing we could do about it. It was out of our hands. It was in God's hands. So connecting it back to today to show that nope, manifest destiny and that dominant narrative is allowing the status quo and discrimination against natives to persist is something important that we talk about. Then we really just introduce students to the idea of settler colonialism. And it's just that basic idea that the removal and erasure of Indigenous peoples in order to take the land for use by settlers in perpetuity is settler colonialism. And that's a definition given by Learning for Justice. And from that same article in Learning for Justice, they quote from the book, The Settler Colonialism Primer, which says this means, because it's in perpetuity, this means that settler colonialism is not just a vicious thing of the past, such as the gold rush, but exists as long as settlers are living on appropriated lands and thus exists today. So again, within the definition, telling students that in perpetuity means that us living on this land that we're on, us doing what we're doing without recognizing the fact that it's indigenous land, we're just as much participants in settler colonialism as people were during westward expansion hundreds of years ago. And then just to get a better idea of that perspective of settler colonialism, we view this free video from Choices. And like I said, I'll send this PowerPoint to Jenny so you can have the link, called The Conquest of North America. And actually the woman from Choices saw this session listed on the Connecticut Social Studies website, and she even emailed me a couple other free sources that I have linked in here as well. And as we look at the video, we fill out as a class this graphic organizer. And so the video starts by just defining settler colonialism. And so students work towards doing that in their own words so that they can understand it themselves. And then it looks at how settler colonialism took place through warfare, through treaties and violations of those treaties that were signed between natives and settlers, or natives and the government, how Indian removal played a role in that. And then the last part of the video connects settler colonialism today. And students then really reflect on what it means to say that this is still an ongoing process. So it's a good way to kick off the unit. And we have 90-minute block periods. So this is something that we can kind of get through usually in a 90-minute block with high schoolers. But it's a good way to kick off the unit and just start students thinking about these different and kind of conflicting perspectives when it comes to Western expansion. And kind of like you brought up too before, Amy, is that idea of, was it our destiny or not? And so when we reframe the narrative, we're challenging those perspectives, and students really struggle at first. I had a lot of students that were just trapped in that idea of, it was our destiny to move west. Like, we wouldn't be where we are today if we didn't. Like, what, a lot of the what ifs, like, what if we didn't? Where would our growing population have gone? Where would we have gotten our resources? You know, we needed to do it for ourselves, kind of looking at it just from a white perspective or a settler perspective. And so as those questions start to come up, we have a discussion of the ideas of intent versus impact. And this is a discussion I have with my classes at the beginning of the year anyways, because we do have some difficult discussions and debates and things like that in class. So we talk about what's the difference between intent and impact. So, you know, intent is what you mean to do or what you think you're going to do, but impact is the actual effect that it has on the people around you or even on yourself. And we talk about it's important to recognize the difference between intent and impact, because what you intend, you might think that you're making a joke and you intend just to be funny, but the impact could be really harmful to somebody else. And so we talk about those differences and we think of examples. And then to help those struggling students with this idea that, well, it was our destiny, we had to do it, this was, you know, what we needed to do to survive, we think about how this relates to manifest destiny and settler colonialism. And so some students start thinking, well, it was our intent to, you know, expand our country and find new resources and accommodate our growing population. But the impact ended up being pretty negative against indigenous groups. So these students can at least start thinking, all right, well, even if, you know, white settlers didn't intend to cause harm, that was the actual impact that they had. And we know obviously that there were plenty of instances where the government and settlers did intend to cause harm, but this helps students kind of ease into this new non-dominant narrative and just think about how settler colonialism can still be related to manifest destiny without necessarily feeling that white guilt that people are so, you know, concerned with today. And at least in the area where I teach, it's a very conservative area. So it's one way to kind of, again, ease into this new, like, different perspective without causing a huge controversy. And One of the things that I use throughout this unit to challenge perspectives when we're reading articles or viewing videos is this graphic organizer, confirm challenge question. And I don't remember exactly where I found it online, but it was a really good fit for this unit, especially. And so as students are engaging in this unit with different texts and videos, in the first column, they're writing down information that confirms what they have already learned about American history. So maybe if they're reading an article about the gold rush, they're writing down information that confirms what they already knew. But maybe that article brings about how treaties were violated with Native Americans in order to encroach on their lands because of the gold rush. And so in that middle column, any information in the article that's new or challenges what they have thought of American history or challenges what they've already learned, they write down in that middle section and we discuss it after. And then the last column is for any questions that they have about the article, and we discuss those too. So sometimes we discuss them as a class, they pair up with others and they research the answers together. But it's a good way for them as they're reading to acknowledge that, all right, what I have learned, I can confirm, but at the same time, what I've learned isn't the end all be all of knowledge. There's still plenty of perspectives that can challenge what I know, and there's still a lot more questions to ask. And so one of the activities that we do when we cover the topics of different conflicts with Native Americans is this confirm challenge question activity. And so we really take a look at the Battle of Little Bighorn, the Wounded Knee Massacre, and the Sand Creek Massacre. And I could share the sheet that we use or the worksheet we use to do this. But what students do is they look at a video, a couple-minute video that just explains the history of the conflict. It gives them the facts of what happened and, some of the why behind it, why it happened. But then they look at an article that explains the impact of the conflict on present day issues. And Teen Vogue actually has a really good section for controversial issues in politics. So if the students are looking at the Sand Creek Massacre, they then read this article about mass shootings are connected to America's legacy of anti-Indigenous violence. And it looks at the links between violence against natives during the 1800s and mass shootings and violence today. And basically the gist of this article says that the way that white settlers and the government acted against Native Americans was just so kind of nonchalant. It was just, all right, we can massacre these people. We can, do what we want with these people and it doesn't matter. And that kind of created a culture of violence in the country today. And so a lot of students, again, struggle with this connection. And that's why we use that confirm challenge question graphic organizer as we look at that, because it helps them think, all right, well, I knew about, these battles, but what I learned was, you have people like Custer who are heroes of these battles, but now we're seeing these negative impacts that this had today. And that's kind of challenging what they thought. So that's how we cover really the topic of conflicts with natives. And there's also a great TED Talk that we'll analyze as a class as well, America's Native Prisoners of War. And it goes through the timeline of these conflicts and goes into more details about treaty violations and also the impacts that has today. So I definitely recommend checking that out if you haven't already viewed that. Then we take a look at Indian boarding schools, really focusing on the Carlisle School. And we start just by analyzing Captain Richard Henry Pratt's on the education of Native Americans. And it's that speech where he says, we need to kill the Indian and save the man. And so students do that to analyze the manifest destiny idea or the white perspective of why these boarding schools were necessary for Native children. But then we look at the settler colonialism perspective, and we do that through an inquiry activity with the National Park Service. So they, and I'll show you what this looks like. So they actually have this really great activity where they have tons of different maps and primary sources and things like that. And basically students are analyzing these sources and then answering some questions that helps them draw conclusions about the actual impact of manifest destiny and settler colonialism and how that impacted specifically the Native population of students. So it's a pretty cool activity, and students do really start to see the negatives with this, they start to see, well, why did Carlisle need a cemetery? Why is this something that would be at a school? Our school doesn't have a cemetery. They look at those different pictures side by side of students entering the school and then after entering the school and see how their culture was stripped away. And it talks about, and they're able to connect it to that idea of settler colonialism being, not just taking the land, but also taking away the culture. And then we do another confirm challenge question activity with this video by Vox, how the US stole thousands of Native American children. And it goes through not only the boarding schools, but then talks about how after the boarding schools were shut down, we then had Native children being taken from their homes and put into adoption services against their family's will. And then it goes over the Indian Child Welfare Act and still the impacts that these removal of children from their homes has on Native culture today. So again, that connection to present day so that students can see how settler colonialism continues to be a force in society, even while they're here. It's not just something in the past. And then one of the bigger things that we do in this unit is a student's research project and presentation. It's their first presentation of the school year, but they each choose a different Indigenous culture, and people choose sometimes not only just the West. I don't limit it to Western Indigenous tribes, even though it is Western expansion. Like I still have students that pick the Mohegan tribe or the Pequots. But really, it's important to just not focus only on those atrocities, like I said before, but also educate each other about Indigenous culture, past and present. And me and a couple colleagues had a professional development session with the Mohegan tribe. And one of the big points that they emphasized was that Indigenous culture is not a thing of the past. That people often talk about Indigenous culture as if, that was something 200 years ago, but it still exists today and it's still being revitalized today. And so the purpose of this project is for students to understand that. So they choose an Indigenous tribe to research and they present their findings to the class. So they look at the geography of the tribe, religion, arts and architecture, politics, economy, society, both historically and in the present day. And they look at their present day status. Are they federally recognized? What issues are the tribe facing? What kind of events does the tribe host and do? And just also look at how settler colonialism affected the tribe. So how are some of the problems they're facing today related to their removal hundreds of years ago and the taking of their land hundreds of years ago? And students really enjoy researching this because they often think about, like, I've heard these tribes like Navajo or Sioux or whatever, but I don't know anything about them. And so they actually really get into looking at the different parts of their culture and sharing that with each other. And so it's a good way to acknowledge and help promote Indigenous cultures in the classroom. And so the last thing that we do in this unit is a weighing the evidence activity through doc teach. And this really addresses those conflicting ideas that students struggle with throughout the unit. So in this activity, students look at different primary source documents and they place them on a scale. And I'll show you in a second, but the scale actually moves with the documents as they place them there. And they're placing them on two sides of the scale. One side that fits the interpretation that expansion was necessary for the nation to grow and prosper despite the negative impact on natives. And then the other interpretation that says the impact on Native American tribes was not worth the expansion. And so they sort the documents onto either side. They take a screenshot of that and put it in their document. And then they answer the question overall using evidence from the unit, from the documents that they just looked at, but was expansion necessary or was the impact not worth the expansion? And so helping them reconcile those conflicting perspectives of manifest destiny and settler colonialism. And a lot of times students end up, even if at the beginning of the unit, they were thinking we had to expand, we had no choice. Their perspectives have definitely changed by the time they get to this point because they do see the other side that yes, in some ways we did need this to grow and prosper, but settler colonialism was not the way to go about doing that. We should have found other avenues. So just So this is from Docs Teach. It's really cool. It's with the National Archives. They have a ton of activities like this if you've never used this before. But you can click on these different documents. A lot of them, some of them are in like cursive and old language, but they'll give you the document itself. Others will show like a transcript if you want to see a transcript of it. And then students go here and they can drag it to wherever they feel it fits what interpretation it supports. And as you, like I said, as you place the documents on the scale, it moves it. So it helps them just visually see the evidence, because sometimes when they just write it on like a T-chart or something like supports or opposes, they have a hard time visualizing which side they want to support. But this gives a really clear-cut visual of, all right, where do these documents fall and where does my thinking fall? And students are actually pretty engaged doing this. Sometimes they hate looking at primary sources, but when they know that they can drag them around and make this scale go up and down for whatever reason, they're more excited to take a look at some of these old sources. So other resources that you can use to help with settler colonialism and incorporating that into your Western expansion unit, the Mohegan tribe has so many educational resources. Samantha Tondro, she's their curriculum director. She's the one that came and did PD with my colleagues and I. And it was super, super valuable learning about mostly just the history of the Mohegan tribe, but then also she shared tons of resources with us that can help us incorporate Native studies throughout our curriculum, not only in a unit like Western expansion. And there's also the Mohegan Challenge Grant, which is run every year, and you apply and explain how you would use the grant to enhance Native studies within your curriculum. And part of getting the grant, you get funds to buy curricular materials. You get Samantha to come out to your school to do professional development. You get to have a member of the Mohegan tribe come and do an outreach program with students where they come and they show some traditional practices, songs, dances, and things like that. And so a colleague and I were runners up for the Mohegan Challenge Grant this year, and that's why we got to do some of these really great things with the Mohegan tribe. But even if you don't get that grant, you can still do it. So I definitely recommend pursuing those ideas. And then choices. So Brown University has their choices units for social studies, and most of them do take on kind of a non-dominant narrative or a challenging kind of social justice perspective. So this first link here takes you to the full Western expansion unit that Brown has in their choices unit that you can purchase. But then these other two links are to free videos about specifically settler colonialism and those ideas. And then the Conquest of North America lesson that goes along with the video I talked about earlier. And those were sources that I used the Conquest of North America lesson already, but the free videos were ones that the curriculum director for Choices reached out and sent me last week when she saw that this webinar was going to be running. And then the last thing, an Indigenous Peoples History of the United States for Young People could be a great little book study to do with your class. I know middle school, it might be a little trickier, but it does give the history of the US from an Indigenous perspective. And there's an adult version of the book, but then this one is written for specifically for students so that it's easier for them to grasp and understand. And there's some discussion points throughout the book as well to help students get, thinking about these new ideas and these new perspectives. So that's kind of the overview of the unit that I do and how I've incorporated settler colonialism into my Western expansion unit. So if you have any questions, if you have any suggestions or, things that you do or how you would make it better, I'd love to hear that, or just any thoughts in general. I would appreciate any of that.